The Cosmic Rest Bar sat in the darkest corner of Station Omega 7 like a forgotten memory. Most people walked past it without a second look. The neon sign outside flickered sometimes, and half the letters did not work anymore. The door was old metal that creaked when it opened, and the paint was peeling off the walls. It was not the kind of place that rich traders or important officials ever visited. Inside the bar, everything was dim and quiet. Old wooden tables sat scattered around the room with chairs that did not match. Some had 3 legs and wobbled when people sat down. Others were too tall or too short, but nobody complained. The walls were covered with pictures and objects from different worlds, but nothing looked expensive. There were bottle caps from drinks that did not exist anymore and photos of places that might have been destroyed years ago. Behind the bar stood an old human man named Heian Wu. His hair was gray, and his face had lines around his eyes from many years of living. He wore a simple brown shirt and black pants that had been washed so many times they were faded. His hands moved slowly but never shook when he poured drinks. He had been running this bar for 30 years, and everyone who came here knew he minded his own business. The customers who came to the Cosmic Rest were not the kind of people who made trouble. They were tired workers who wanted a cheap drink after long shifts. Miners with dirt under their fingernails who did not want to talk about what they had seen in the deep tunnels. Cargo pilots who had been flying the same routes for decades and just wanted somewhere quiet to sit. People came here because Heian Wu never asked questions and the prices were fair. On this evening, the bar was almost empty like most evenings. In the far corner sat Dako, an old cargo pilot who flew supplies between the outer rim planets. He was drinking his usual beer and staring at nothing in particular. His ship was getting old and making strange noises, but he could not afford to replace it yet. He came to the Cosmic Rest because Heian Wu let him drink slowly and never rushed him to leave. At a small table near the wall sat Unji, a station mechanic who fixed the life support systems that kept everyone breathing. She was playing cards by herself because she had finished her shift early and had nowhere else to go. Her apartment was too small and too quiet, so she came here to listen to other people talking quietly in the background. The cards were old and some had corners missing, but they still worked fine for simple games. The bar felt peaceful and safe, like it always did. Han Wu cleaned glasses with a white towel and hummed quietly to himself. The air recyclers made a soft humming sound, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the normal sounds of a space station. Ships docking and taking off. Workers calling to each other in the corridors. The everyday sounds of life continuing as it always had. Then everything changed. The front door opened with a loud hiss that cut through the quiet atmosphere like a knife. Cold air rushed in from the corridor outside, carrying the smell of metal and something else that made people uncomfortable. The peaceful feeling in the bar disappeared instantly, as if someone had sucked all the warmth out of the room. 5 creatures walked through the door, and everyone inside knew immediately that trouble had arrived. They were Kalahari slavers, tall reptilian beings with dark green scales that looked like armor. Their eyes were bright yellow and moved constantly, as if they were always looking for something to hunt. Each one was nearly 7 feet tall, with long arms that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through metal. The leader of the group was even bigger than the others. Scars covered his face and neck, telling stories of fights he had survived. One of his eyes had a white mark across it where something had tried to blind him and failed. He wore black leather clothing that had metal studs, and his belt held weapons that most stations banned. When he walked, his boots made heavy sounds on the floor that echoed through the suddenly quiet bar. Behind him came 4 other slavers, all looking around the room like predators who had found a nest full of prey. They wore similar dark clothing and carried the same kind of weapons. Their yellow eyes missed nothing as they examined every corner of the bar, every person sitting quietly at their tables, every possible exit or hiding place. Dok-Ho looked up from his beer and his face went pale. He had seen Kalahari slavers before at other stations and knew what they did for a living. They captured people from colonies and settlements, then sold them to buyers who needed workers for dangerous jobs. They did not care if their victims were young or old, male or female. They only cared about how much money each person could bring them. Eun-G stopped playing with her cards and tried to make herself smaller in her chair. She had heard stories about what happened when slavers came to a station. Sometimes they just bought supplies and left. Other times they decided they needed more merchandise and started looking around for people who would not be missed. Station workers like her were perfect targets because they had no families to ask questions. The scarred leader looked around the bar with obvious disgust. He saw the old furniture and peeling paint and flickering lights. He saw the cheap decorations on the walls and the simple wooden bar that had been repaired many times over the years. Everything about the place seemed to offend him, as if he could not believe such a poor establishment was allowed to exist. He walked over to the bar with heavy steps that made the floor vibrate, his yellow eyes fixed on Hyun-woo, who continued cleaning a glass as if nothing had changed. The old bartender did not look up or show any sign that he was worried about his new customers. His hands remained steady and his breathing stayed calm and even. The slaver leader slammed his clawed hand down on the wooden surface of the bar hard enough to make bottles rattle. The sound was like thunder in the quiet room and made everyone jump except for Hyun-woo. The old man just looked up slowly, as if someone had politely asked for his attention instead of trying to intimidate him. In a voice like grinding rocks, the slaver demanded the strongest drink the bar had. He spoke in broken standard, the common language used for trade between different species. His accent was thick and harsh, making every word sound like a threat. The other slavers spread out through the small bar, making themselves comfortable without asking permission. Hyun-woo simply nodded and reached for a bottle on the shelf behind him. His movements were calm and unhurried, as if he served dangerous criminals every day. He poured the drink into a clean glass and set it down in front of the scarred leader without saying a word. His face showed no emotion and his eyes revealed nothing about what he might be thinking. The other slavers had started moving chairs and tables to suit themselves better. They knocked over an empty chair and did not bother to pick it up. One of them put his boots up on a table that Eun-G had been using for her cards, scattering them across the floor. Another one grabbed a bottle from behind the bar without asking and took a long drink straight from it. They were acting like they owned the place, like the bar and everyone in it belonged to them now. It was the kind of behavior that most people expected from Kalahari slavers. They took what they wanted and did not care about anyone else. The galaxy was full of beings who feared them, and they liked it that way. But Hyun-woo just continued cleaning glasses and did not react to their rudeness. He had seen worse behavior in his 30 years of running the bar, and he knew that sometimes the best thing to do was wait and see what happened next. His customers were nervous, but they trusted him to handle the situation as he always did. The night was just beginning, and none of them knew yet how much everything was about to change. The mocking began almost immediately after the slavers settled into their stolen seats. The scarred leader took another sip of his drink and made a face like he had tasted poison. He spit the liquid onto the floor and declared loudly that even the alcohol in this pathetic place was weak. His companions roared with laughter as if this was the funniest thing they had ever heard. One of the younger slavers, a thin creature with bright yellow eyes, pointed at the decorations on the walls. He asked his friends if they had ever seen such worthless junk in their lives. The photos of different worlds looked like places that nobody important had ever visited. The bottle caps and trinkets seemed like the kind of garbage that poor people collected because they could not afford real art. The leader stood up from his chair and walked around the bar, examining everything with exaggerated disgust. He picked up a small statue from one of the tables and turned it over in his clawed hands. It was carved from wood and showed a human family standing together. The slaver made jokes about how ugly humans were and how this little statue proved that even their art was terrible. Hyun-woo continued cleaning glasses behind the bar. His movements stayed steady and calm even as the insults grew worse. He had heard many things over the years and learned that sometimes the best response was no response at all. But something about these particular customers was different. They were not just rude travelers or drunk miners. They were killers who made their living from other people's suffering. The conversation took A darker turn when the slavers began talking about their recent work. They described raids on colony worlds where they had captured hundreds of people. Families torn apart, children separated from parents, workers taken from their homes to be sold in distant markets. They spoke about human suffering like other people. Might discuss the weather. The scarred leader bragged about a settlement they had hit just a few weeks earlier. It was a farming community on one of the Kepler worlds where people grew food for the Outer Rim colonies. The slavers had arrived at night and surrounded the entire town before anyone could escape. They took everyone who looked strong enough to work and burned the rest of the buildings to cover their tracks. One of the younger slavers seemed especially proud of destroying the local school. He described how the building had gone up in flames, and how the books had burned like paper. The children inside had screamed when they realized their parents were not coming to save them. He laughed as he told the story as if the terror of innocent children was the most entertaining thing in the galaxy. During a brief pause in their cruel laughter, Hyun-woo spoke for the first time since they had arrived. His voice was quiet but clear as he asked if they had been to the Kepler colonies recently. The question seemed innocent enough, but something in his tone made the scarred leader look at him more carefully. The slaver was happy to brag about their success in that sector. They had taken nearly 200 humans from the farming settlement, mostly young and strong people who would bring good prices in the work camps. He described the raid in detail, seeming to enjoy what he thought was the old man's discomfort. What he did not notice was the way Hyun-woo's hands had stopped moving. The bartender asked another quiet question about which settlement they had attacked. When the leader described the location and mentioned the school that had been burned, Hyun-woo set down his cleaning cloth with unusual care. For just a moment his composed mask slipped and something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. Eunji caught the change from her table where she was pretending to organize the scattered cards. She had known the old bartender for 5 years, and had never seen that expression on his face before. It was like watching a sleeping predator wake up and realize there was prey nearby. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The slavers continued their boasting, unaware that anything had changed. They talked about their next targets and how much money they expected to make from their recent captures. The leader described the different markets where humans were sold and which types of buyers paid the most for different kinds of workers. Children went to one market, adults to another, and families were always separated to prevent escape attempts. Hyun-woo reached under the counter ostensibly for another bottle, but his fingers brushed against something hidden beneath the bar. The object was small and had been waiting there for years like a sleeping weapon. His touch was careful and reverent, like a person greeting an old friend who had been gone for too long. The thin slaver noticed that the old man had become very quiet and demanded to know if he had a problem with their business. When Hyun-woo did not immediately answer, the creature stood up menacingly and repeated his question with more force. His clawed hand moved toward the weapon on his belt as if he was considering whether the old bartender needed a lesson in manners. Hyun-woo looked up from the glass he was polishing and met the creature's yellow eyes directly. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said that he had indeed been to the Kepler colonies. In fact, he used to live there in a small farming community where everyone knew each other's names and helped their neighbors during difficult times. The slavers found this confession amusing, and the leader asked mockingly if he missed his little farm. Did the old man wish he could go back to growing vegetables and feeding animals instead of serving drinks to superior beings like themselves? The other slavers chuckled at their leader's wit and waited to see how the human would respond to this. Humiliation. The old bartender's response was simple and devastating. He told them in the same quiet voice that his daughter had been a teacher at the settlement school, the same school they had just finished bragging about burning down with children inside. The laughter in the bar died instantly as the implications of his words sank into their minds. The scarred leader stopped smiling and stared at Hyun-woo with new attention. The other slavers looked at each other uncertainly, not sure how to respond to this unexpected revelation. They were used to their victims being either dead or far away, not serving them drinks in a dim bar on a forgotten station. The atmosphere in the cosmic rest had changed completely. What had been casual cruelty suddenly felt much more personal and dangerous. The mild-mannered bartender was gone, replaced by something much older and infinitely more threatening. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge and patient fury. He told them about his daughter, Bao Young, and how she had dedicated her life to teaching children on the frontier worlds. She had been brilliant and kind, the sort of person who made the galaxy a better place just by existing. She had believed that education could build bridges between different species and that knowledge was the key to lasting peace. The slavers tried to laugh it off, but their mirth sounded forced, now uncertain. The scarred leader attempted to regain control of the situation by threatening the old man. He snarled that perhaps they should take him along when they left and let him join his precious daughter wherever dead humans went, but Hyun-woo was no longer the harmless old bartender they had walked in to mock. Something ancient and deadly had awakened behind his calm gray eyes, and the slavers were beginning to realize they might have made a very serious mistake. The atmosphere in the cosmic rest changed like a switch being flipped from light to darkness. The casual cruelty that had filled the room moments before suddenly felt much more dangerous and personal. The slavers looked at each other with growing uncertainty as they realized their entertainment had taken an unexpected turn. Hyun-woo continued polishing his glass as if nothing had changed, but everyone in the room could feel the shift in his presence. The mild-mannered bartender was gone, completely replaced by something that made the air feel heavy and threatening. When he moved now, each gesture was precise and controlled like a weapon, being prepared for use. The scarred leader tried to regain control of the situation by laughing loudly at the old man's revelation. He told his companions that this was even funnier than he had expected. Not only was the bar owner a pathetic human, but he was also a grieving father who had lost his precious little daughter. The other slavers joined in, but their laughter sounded hollow and forced. Hyun-woo sat down his glass and looked directly at each slaver in turn. His gaze was calm but absolutely merciless, like a predator evaluating prey before deciding how to kill it. The yellow-eyed creatures found themselves unable to maintain eye contact with the old human and looked away one by one. He told them about Bao Young in the same quiet voice, but now there was something underneath the words that made everyone listen. She had been 26 years old when she died. She had spent 3 years teaching children on the frontier worlds because she believed education was the most important gift anyone could give. She had been planning to marry a young farmer named Jin-ho, and they had talked about having children of their own someday. The thin slaver interrupted impatiently, asking what any of this had to do with them. So the old man had lost his daughter, so what? People died all the time, especially weak humans who chose to live on dangerous frontier worlds. If she had been smart, she would have stayed somewhere safe instead of playing teacher in the middle of nowhere. Hyun-woo nodded thoughtfully as if considering this point of view. Then he asked them a simple question that made everyone in the room go cold. He wanted to know if they had any idea who they were threatening. Did they understand what kind of person they had chosen to mock and humiliate in his own establishment? The scarred leader attempted to sound confident as he answered. Obviously, the old man was just another washed-up human playing bartender on a forgotten station. Maybe he had been a farmer once or a small-time trader before losing everything. After all, what else could a human be that would matter to superior beings like themselves? The question hung in the air for a long moment before Hyun-woo answered. His response was quiet and matter-of-fact, delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather or the price of supplies. He told them that before he became a bartender, he had been other things, a soldier, for instance, a hunter. Some people had even called him a ghost. Dakho, who had been listening from his corner table, suddenly went very pale. Unlike the slavers, he recognized the implications of what the old man was saying. He had heard stories in the outer sector's legends about human soldiers who had operated beyond the frontier. Names whispered in the darkest corners of space, stations and mining colonies. The old cargo pilot quietly began moving toward the exit, his survival instincts screaming warnings that his conscious mind was only beginning to understand. 30 years of flying dangerous routes had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to turn deadly in every alarm in. His head was going off at maximum volume. Hyun-woo reached under the bar again, this time pulling out an old military identification card. The plastic was faded and worn from years of handling, but the text was still readable. It identified him as Colonel Hyun-woo Park, formerly of the Human Colonial Defense Force Special Operations Division. The title beneath his name was simple but chilling: Genocide Specialist. The slavers stared at the card in confusion. They had never heard of the Colonial Defense Force, and the human military structure meant nothing to them. But Yoonji knew what it meant, and her face went white with shock. She had been drinking with a legend, someone whose exploits were whispered about in the darkest corners of known space. The Colonial Defense Force had been humanity's answer to the alien threat during the early years of galactic expansion. When other species tried to wipe out human colonies or enslave human populations, the CDF had responded with brutal efficiency. Their special operations teams had been responsible for some of the most devastating military actions in recent galactic history. Genocide specialists were the most feared soldiers in human space. They were experts at hunting down and eliminating entire alien military organizations. They could disappear into the darkness between stars and emerge months later, having destroyed enemies that thought themselves untouchable. Most people believed they were myth stories told to frighten criminals and pirates. The scarred leader snatched the card and examined it closely, then laughed dismissively. He declared it obviously fake, probably something the old man had bought to impress customers or scare away troublemakers. After all, if this pathetic bartender had really been some sort of elite soldier, wouldn't someone have heard of him? Hyun-woo's smile was colder than the vacuum between stars. He told them that they were absolutely right to doubt him. After all, the best ghosts were the ones that people convinced themselves didn't exist. The most successful hunters were the ones their prey never saw coming until it was far too late. He began walking around the bar with deliberate slowness, each step measured and controlled. As he moved, he told them more about his former career, how he had spent 15 years tracking down slavers and pirates and other criminals who preyed on human colonies, how he had learned to be patient and careful and thorough in his work. The slavers were beginning to look nervous, but they were still not ready to believe that this old bartender could be a threat to them. The leader demanded proof, claiming that anyone could carry a fake identification card and make up stories about military service. If Hyun-woo was really so dangerous, why was he hiding in a rundown bar instead of commanding a fleet? The old man stopped walking and looked at them with something that might have been pity. He explained that he had retired from active duty after completing his final mission. The target had been a slaving operation that was capturing human children and selling them to alien buyers who used them for medical experiments. It had taken him 2 years to track down every person involved in that particular network. When he finished his work, 347 criminals were dead. Their ships were destroyed, their bases were reduced to radioactive ash, and their financial networks were completely eliminated. The galaxy had become a slightly safer place for human children, and Hyun-woo had decided it was time to find a quieter life. But retirement, he told them, did not mean he had forgotten his skills or lost his contacts. It just meant he was more selective about the targets he chose. He had spent the last 30 years watching and waiting and gathering information about the various criminal organizations that operated in this sector of space. The Kalahari slaving network they belonged to had been very busy lately and very sloppy about covering their tracks. They had attacked too many human settlements and killed too many innocent people. Someone was going to have to do something about that problem, and Hyun-woo had decided that someone would be him. The scarred leader was beginning to understand that they were in serious trouble, but he was not ready to give up yet. He pulled out a plasma weapon and aimed it at the old man's chest, demanding that he stop talking nonsense and serve them drinks like a proper bartender should. Hyun-woo looked at the weapon with mild interest, then asked if the creature had ever heard of reactive armor plating. Before anyone could answer, he pressed a small button on a device he had pulled from beneath the counter. The walls of the bar suddenly shimmered and revealed their true nature. The question hung in the air like a physical presence that pressed down on everyone in the room. The slavers had no answer because they all knew that children and teachers had not been given any choices when the raiders arrived. They had simply been merchandise to be collected and processed. Their individual worth measured only in credits and market demand. The scarred leader tried to explain that business was business and that personal feelings had no place in profitable enterprises. The galaxy was full of weak species who could not protect themselves, and stronger beings had every right to take advantage of that weakness. It was simply the natural order of things, and humans were foolish to think otherwise. Hien-Wu listened to this explanation with the same calm attention he had given everything else that evening. When the slaver finished talking, the old bartender nodded slowly as if he understood the logic behind such thinking. Then he activated one final screen that made everyone in the room fall silent. The display showed a live feed from the rebuilt farming settlement on Kepler 7 where Bio Young had taught school. The community was slowly recovering, but the school remained a burned ruin that no one had been able to bring themselves to rebuild. A small memorial had been erected where the building once stood, listing the names of those who had died in the attack. Ba Young Park's name was near the top of the list, along with 16 children, whose ages ranged from 6 to 14 years old. They had been trapped in the building when the slavers set it on fire and had died from smoke inhalation before the flames could reach them. The memorial included small pictures of each victim and fresh flowers that someone placed there. Every week, Hien-Wu studied the memorial for a long moment, then turned back to his prisoners. His voice was calm and final as he explained that he had already received the only payment that mattered: justice for his daughter and the thousands of others who had suffered at the hands of people like them. The screens around the bar continued updating throughout the night, showing the systematic destruction of the Kalahari slaving network. Station after station fell silent, ship after ship disappeared from sensor screens, and gradually the galactic community began to understand that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power. The operation was more extensive than anyone could have imagined. Hien-Wu had spent 3 decades building his network and gathering intelligence about every major slaving organization in known space. The attack on his daughter's school had been the final piece of evidence he needed to justify what he was about to unleash on the galaxy. By morning, the scope of the coordinated strikes became clear. Over 40 major slaving operations had been hit simultaneously across 12 different star systems. Thousands of slaves had been liberated, billions of credits in illegal assets had been seized, and the organizational structure that had enabled the trade had been shattered beyond repair. The slavers in the bar watched their entire world crumble. On the screens around them, ships they recognized exploded in balls of fire. Bases they had visited were reduced to smoking craters. People they knew were either dead or in custody, facing charges that would keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Hien-Wu worked through the information provided by his prisoners with methodical precision. Each detail was cross-referenced, verified, and passed along to the appropriate members of his network. The slavers had tried to hold back important facts at first, but the old man seemed to know when they were lying, and had ways of encouraging complete honesty. The authorities began arriving at Station Omega 7 as word of the night's events spread across the communication networks. Colonial Marines, Interstellar Police, and representatives from a dozen different governments all wanted to speak with the man who had orchestrated the largest anti-slavery operation in galactic history. Hien-Wu greeted them all with the same mild courtesy he had once shown regular customers. He provided detailed briefings, complete evidence files, and full cooperation with their investigations. The legal proceedings would take years to sort through, but the perpetrators were going nowhere, and justice would eventually be served through proper channels. The 5 slavers who had mocked him in his bar were just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Within weeks, arrest warrants were issued for hundreds of individuals across the galaxy. The intelligence gathered during the raids led to even more operations, creating a cascade effect that dismantled criminal networks far beyond the Original targets: some of the rescued slaves were humans who had been captured from frontier settlements, like the one where Bo Young had taught. Others were members of different species who had fallen victim to the same criminal enterprises. All of them owed their freedom to an old bartender who had never forgotten his daughter or the promise he had made at her grave. The network HFY had built was not just about revenge, although that had certainly been part of his motivation. It was about creating a galaxy where teachers could work without fear, where children could attend school without worrying about raiders, and where decent people could live their lives without looking over their shoulders. As the sun rose over Station Omega-7, the last of the evidence was catalogued, and the prisoners were transferred to secure facilities. The cosmic rest remained sealed while investigators combed through every inch of the establishment, documenting the sophisticated equipment that had been hidden behind the facade of a simple bar. HFY sat quietly in a holding cell, not because he was under arrest, but because it was the safest place for him, while various government agencies decided how to handle his case. He had committed acts that were technically illegal, but had done so in service of a greater justice that transcended normal law enforcement capabilities. The old man seemed perfectly content to wait while lawyers and politicians argued about jurisdiction and proper procedures. He had accomplished what he had set out to do, and nothing else really mattered. His daughter could finally rest in peace, knowing that the people who had killed her would never hurt anyone else. The galaxy was a safer place. Now, though, most citizens would never learn exactly why. The slave trade still existed, but operated in much smaller, more cautious networks. The big operations were gone broken by a man who had proven that sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places. In the days that followed, news reports would describe the coordinated raids as a joint operation by multiple law enforcement agencies. The role of a retired bartender would be mentioned only briefly, if at all. HFY preferred it that way because the best hunters were the ones their prey never saw coming. The memorial on Kepler 7 received a new edition that week. Someone had left a simple bouquet of flowers with a note that read, "Bo Young, your students have been avenged." The handwriting was careful and precise, like that of someone who had spent many years writing reports and filling out official documents. The flowers were white roses, the same kind that Bo Young had grown in the small garden behind her house. They were beautiful and fresh, as if they had been picked that very morning from a place where love still bloomed, despite the darkness that sometimes covered the stars. 3 months later, the cosmic rest reopened with little fanfare or public attention. The military equipment had been removed, the reinforced walls had been covered with normal paneling, and the emergency systems had been deactivated. To most observers, it looked exactly like the simple bar it had always appeared to be. HFY was back behind the counter, cleaning glasses and serving drinks as if nothing had changed. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, but no charges had been filed against him. Too many important people owed their freedom to his network, and too many government officials were quietly grateful that someone had finally dealt with the slaving problem. The customers who returned to the bar treated the old bartender with a respect that bordered on reverence. Word had spread through the underground networks about what had really happened that night, and even hardened criminals spoke his name with careful courtesy. Nobody wanted to be the next person to underestimate. The mild-mannered man who poured their drinks. Diokaho was among the first regulars to return, though he seemed much more nervous than before. The old cargo pilot had spent 3 months thinking about what he had witnessed and trying to understand how he had failed to recognize one of the most dangerous men in the galaxy. He still came for his usual beer, but he was much more polite, and never complained about anything. EU Unjai also returned, but she brought friends with her. Other station workers who had heard the stories and wanted to see the legendary bartender for themselves. They were all very well behaved and left generous tips even for simple drinks. The bar was busier than it had ever been, but the atmosphere remained quiet and respectful. New customers began arriving as well. Some were former slaves who had been liberated during the raids and wanted to thank the man who had made their freedom possible. Others were law enforcement officers who respected what HFY had accomplished and considered him an ally in their ongoing fight against organized crime. Occasionally, someone would approach the bar with information about other criminals, other injustices that needed addressing. Han Wu would listen politely, take mental notes, and continue cleaning his glasses with steady hands. He never promised anything, but somehow problems had a way of being solved, and bad people had a tendency to disappear. The galaxy had indeed become a safer place, though the full extent of the changes was not immediately obvious. The slave trade continued to exist, but in much smaller, more careful operations. The big networks were gone, and the survivors lived in constant fear that the ghost who had destroyed their predecessors might come for them next. Pirates and raiders found that attacking human settlements was no longer the profitable enterprise it had once been. Too many of their colleagues had vanished without explanation, and too many secure bases had been reduced to radioactive ash. Word spread through criminal circles that humans were protected by something dark and terrible that struck without warning. Government officials who had taken bribes to look the other way when slavers operated in their territory discovered that their corruption had consequences. Some found themselves facing criminal charges, while others simply disappeared during routine travel between star systems. The message was clear to those who chose to hear it. The Kepler colony had completed its rebuilding and was thriving once again. A new school had been constructed on the site where the old one had burned, and classes were being taught by teachers who had volunteered from across human space. The memorial remained as a reminder of what had been lost, but also as a symbol of what had been avenged. Bo Young's former students, who had survived the attack because they were sick that day or visiting relatives, had grown up to become teachers themselves. They carried on her work and her memory, teaching new generations of children that education was the path to a better future. Her influence lived on through them and through the countless lives that her father's actions had saved. Han Wu kept a small photo of his daughter behind the bar where only he could see it. The picture showed her standing in front of a classroom full of smiling children, all of them eager to learn what she had to teach. On quiet evenings when the bar was nearly empty, he would look at the photo and raise a glass to her memory. The old bartender had found a new purpose in his retirement. He was no longer actively hunting criminals, but he remained vigilant, always watching for signs that someone needed help or that justice needed to be served. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be predators who preyed on the innocent, but now those predators knew that somewhere in the darkness between the stars there was an old man who remembered every injustice and had the skills and connections to do something about it. They knew that actions had consequences and that some debts could never be forgiven or forgotten. The Cosmic Rest had returned to being a quiet corner bar on a forgotten station, but everyone who entered now understood that appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the galaxy was the one who looked like what had appeared to be simple metal paneling was actually advanced military armor, the kind used on warships designed to survive battles in deep space. The plasma pistol in the slaver's hand, deadly as it was, would barely scratch the surface of walls that could withstand naval bombardment. The Cosmic Rest was not just a bar, it was a fortress disguised as a simple drinking establishment. The lighting in the room changed from warm and dim to harsh white that revealed every corner and shadow. Hidden panels slid open in the walls, exposing equipment that definitely did not belong in any normal business. Military-grade sensors, communication arrays, and other devices that the slavers could not identify but knew meant serious trouble. Han Wu placed another small device on the bar with gentle care, like someone handling a sleeping child. He explained in conversational tones that the Cosmic Rest had some very interesting security features modifications he had installed over the years. The emergency lockdown system, for instance, was quite sophisticated and had never failed a single test. The scarred leader demanded to know what the old man was talking about, but his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. The other slavers were looking around the bar with new eyes, suddenly noticing details they had missed before. The windows were not just reinforced, they were blast-resistant. The ceiling was higher than it should be and lined with materials that looked suspiciously like military-grade shielding. As if responding to an unspoken command, the front door sealed with a solid thunk that echoed through the suddenly quiet room. Emergency barriers dropped into place, turning the entrance into an armored bulkhead that could withstand assault weapons and military explosives. The slavers spun around in alarm, finally understanding that they were no longer customers in a bar. They were prisoners in a trap that had been 30 years in the making. Hyun-woo continued his explanation in the same mild tone he had used to discuss the weather. He told them that after retiring from active service, he had chosen this location very carefully. Station Omega 7 was positioned perfectly along several major trade routes, making it an ideal place to monitor traffic. Criminal traffic in particular. The bar had been designed from the beginning to serve two purposes. During normal times, it was exactly what it appeared to be: a quiet place for tired workers to have a drink and forget their troubles. But when necessary, it could become something much more dangerous: a secure facility where justice could be dispensed without interference from corrupt officials or complicated legal procedures. One of the younger slavers pulled out a different weapon and aimed it at Hyun-woo, demanding that he open the doors immediately. The old bartender looked at the energy rifle with the same mild interest. He had shown the plasma pistol, then asked if any of them had military experience. When they did not answer, he explained that the walls were rated to withstand direct hits from starship weapons. The creature fired his rifle at the nearest wall, producing a bright flash and a loud noise, but absolutely no damage. The energy beam was absorbed by the armor plating and converted into heat that was immediately vented through hidden cooling systems. The slaver stared at his weapon in disbelief, then fired again with the same result. Hyun-woo walked around the bar with unhurried steps, moving like someone who had all the time in the galaxy. He told them that he had been monitoring their activities for weeks, tracking their ship's movements and documenting their crimes. The Kalahari slaving operation they belonged to had been very busy lately, attacking human settlements and selling the survivors to buyers in the Outer Rim. The scarred leader tried to bluster, threatening consequences if they did not return to their ship on schedule. He claimed that their crew would come looking for them, that this old human could not possibly hold them indefinitely. Someone would notice they were missing and send help to rescue them from whatever trap this was. Hyun-woo nodded thoughtfully and agreed that their crew was indeed a concern that needed to be addressed. He activated another control, and screens descended from the ceiling, showing various views of the station's docking bay. The slavers watched in growing horror as their ship suddenly exploded in a brilliant fireball that lit up the entire sector. The blast was contained within the docking bay's shields, but their vessel and everyone aboard it were gone in seconds. Pieces of hull plating and engine components drifted past the viewing ports like metallic snow, while emergency crews rushed to contain the damage and prevent fires from spreading to other ships. Hyun-woo explained that he had taken the liberty of planting charges on their vessel while they were enjoying their drinks and making jokes about human weakness. It had seemed like the most efficient way to deal with the rest of their operation and ensure that their conversation would not be interrupted by unwanted visitors. The destruction of their ship shattered the last of the slavers' bravado. They huddled together in the center of the bar, finally understanding the true nature of their situation. The scarred leader's voice cracked as he demanded to know what the old man wanted from them, what it would take to convince him to let them go. Hyun-woo returned to his position behind the bar and resumed cleaning glasses as if nothing unusual had happened. He told them that he wanted several things, starting with information about their organization. Names, locations, operational details, everything they knew about the Kalahari slaving network and the people who supported it. The slavers exchanged glances, clearly torn between fear of their leaders back home and the immediate threat sitting across from them. Hyun-woo helped them make their decision by activating another screen that showed real-time feeds from various locations across the galaxy. Armed figures were moving with military precision, attacking installations and boarding ships. He explained that he had not been entirely truthful about his retirement. While he no longer worked directly for the Colonial Defense Force, he had maintained certain relationships with like-minded individuals, former soldiers who had grown tired of watching criminals prey on innocent people. Law enforcement officers who had become frustrated with corruption and bureaucracy. The screens showed simultaneous raids on slaving operations across 6 different star systems, all coordinated from his humble little bar. Ships were being boarded, prison camps were being liberated, and the carefully constructed infrastructure of the slave trade was crumbling in real time. Decades of criminal enterprise were being dismantled in a single coordinated strike. The network he had built over 30 years of apparent retirement was impressive and far-reaching. It included people from dozens of different species, all united by their hatred of those who bought and sold sentient lives. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and the destruction of Bo Young's school had provided all the motivation they needed. One by one, the slavers began to talk. They provided details about shipping routes, buyers, holding facilities, and the corrupt officials who enabled their operations. Han Wu recorded everything with professional efficiency, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his deep understanding of their criminal network. As the information flowed, more screens activated around the bar. Each one showed another raid in progress, another slaving operation being dismantled by his network of hunters. The Galactic slave trade was a massive enterprise, but it depended on secrecy and the assumption that no one cared enough to stop it. Han Wu had proven that assumption wrong, and now the entire criminal ecosystem was paying the price. The old bartender, who had seemed so harmless, was actually the center of the largest anti-slavery operation in galactic history, and tonight was the night when 30 years of careful planning finally bore fruit. The scarred leader, desperate to salvage something from the disaster, offered Han Wu a deal. He had access to significant resources, hidden accounts that could make the old man wealthy beyond imagination. All he wanted in return was safe passage off the station and a head start before any authorities arrived to sort through the mess. Hyon-Wu considered the offer with apparent seriousness, even nodding thoughtfully as if weighing the merits of the proposal. Then he asked a simple question that cut through all the slavers' desperate promises like a knife through soft flesh. He wanted to know if his daughter had been offered any deals when their ships arrived at her school.